Hello everyone, great to be with you today. We're continuing our study in the book of James. We've been looking for the last month in particular at a theme that James develops throughout his book. It's on the trials of our faith, and you may remember in the first message we saw what James says in chapter 1 about how God uses the trials of our faith to refine our faith and purify our faith. And that we can even rejoice when our trials come because we can see the trials from God's perspective, knowing that God is using them for his purposes. But that's not always easy to do. Sometimes we don't have the spiritual insight that we need to do that. And so in the second message we saw how James tells us when we lack that wisdom, that spiritual insight to see the trials of our lives from God's perspective, all we have to do is ask for them. And then in last week's message we saw how the trials of our faith test our patience, and we saw earlier in the passage that I'm going to read just one verse from tonight from James chapter 5, how James talks again about patience or endurance and what a large part waiting plays in the Christian life. And so in last week's message we talked about patiently waiting. Tonight I'm going to look at one verse that we actually read and touched on last week, but there's a lot here, and I wanted to take one message just to talk about verse 11. So this is James chapter 5, verse 11. James writes this: "We count those blessed who endured. You have heard of the endurance of Job and have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings, that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful." Many of you might remember the radio show that Paul Harvey did. It was called The Rest of the Story. Do you remember it? He would tell a familiar story about something that we all thought we knew, and then he'd tell those little known details or perhaps unknown details, and that would be the rest of the story. An example I can remember one was about the old Andy Griffith show, and he recounted some of the familiar characters in the Andy Griffith show in the fictional town of Mayberry. That's the part we all knew. And then the rest of the story was that Mayberry was actually based on Andy Griffith's hometown of Mount Airy, North Carolina, the hometown where he grew up, and many of the fictional characters were based on real life characters that he had known growing up in Mount Airy, North Carolina. So in other words, the rest of the story. Now, in a sense, that's what James says in this verse that we read just a moment ago. Reminding us about Job, he says that we have seen my translation here says you have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings with Job. If you're at home reading in your own Bible, following along, what does your translation say there? We have seen the outcome of the Lord's dealings. Some of your translations may see we have seen the end. Some of the translations say we have seen the purpose. Some of the translations say we have seen the conclusion. The idea of the word there in the Greek language is to see the final outcome of something. In other words, we see the end of the story or the rest of the story. We see how things turned out. One way to visualize this, what James is talking about, you remember those old telescopes you might see in the pirate movies where, the captain would come out onto the deck and he would hold something in his hands that didn't look like a telescope at all. It just looked like a flat disc. But then he would begin to unfold it, and stage by stage, bit by bit, he would extend it until it was fully extended, and then you could see it's a telescope. That's the exact idea that James is talking about here, that quite often in the tests of our faith, in God's dealings with us, we don't see the purpose at the beginning. It may be that the test that you are going through right now, the trials of your faith, you may not see God's purpose in them until you come to the end of them. And he's saying that's what it was like with Job. Job didn't see what God was doing during the trials. It was only when he came to the end that Job saw what God was doing. And it's that way quite often in the Christian life. It's not when we're going through the trials that we know what God is up to. It's not while we're looking ahead. Quite often it's when we come to the end and we're looking in the rear view mirror at where we've been, that we see what God was up to, and we see what God was doing and how God was leading us all along. James is saying that God has a purpose in the tests of your faith, and that the purpose may not be evident at first. And so James wants us to know that there is more to the story than just the trials of our faith. That's the part we know. James wants us to know the rest of the story. So what is it that God does in our trials? We know in a broad sense what we saw in chapter 1, that God uses the trials to refine us and to purify us. But what specifically does that mean? I'm going to give you 5 examples tonight of some of the specific things that God accomplishes in our lives through our tests. Now, I don't mean this list to be the complete list. There are other things God does as well. But I think these 5 are borne out scripturally and just from experience. These are some of the things God does through the trials of our faith and in the tests of our lives. Number 1, suffering builds character. Do you remember the people from the Great Depression? Did you know some of them? My parents, for example, grew up during the Depression. Some of you people who are my age or older, you certainly remember those who grew up in the Depression. Do you remember what those people were like? They were tough. They were resilient. They could endure anything. They could get through anything. And you know why? Because they had endured everything. They knew what it was to be tested, not just on a daily basis, but on an hourly basis. Their entire lives were one long series of tests, one after another. And it shaped them. It made them who they were. No one likes to be tested. No one likes to suffer. But have you ever thought about what kind of person you would be had your faith never been tested? Have you ever thought about what kind of person you would be if you had never suffered? You'd be weak. You'd be fragile. Because suffering builds character. And so when James talks about the tests of our faith or the suffering that we must endure, that's one of the things God does through suffering. It builds character. Another thing that suffering does, it teaches patience. James writes in the verse we read today that blessed are those who endured. And there's that word again. We've seen it in chapter 1. We saw it earlier in chapter 5. Now here it is again. And you remember that the word can be translated patience. It can be translated persistence or perseverance or endurance. And what the word literally means, you might recall, is the ability to stand up under a heavy burden and not be crushed by it. And James says that that's what suffering does. It builds that characteristic in us. I think this ties into verse 8. We read verse 8 last week when he tells us to be patient, and he says, strengthen your hearts or establish your hearts. That word that's translated there as strengthen or establish, it has the idea of holding your ground. I picture a fighter getting into his fighting stance, and he's holding his ground. He's standing his ground. There's a note of defiance in this. There is a note of determination, because patience is active. You may recall we went over that last week, that suffering is passive. It's something that happens to us. But patience is active. It's something we do. And that's how James pictures this when he tells us to establish our hearts or to strengthen our hearts. We are actively, patiently holding our ground in a world of trouble. You know, when it comes to patience, I probably get more questions as a pastor about patience than anything else. Evidently, almost every Christian in the world considers themselves to be impatient. Almost every Christian I talk to when the subject comes up, they say, I am not a patient person. I need more patience. Well, how do you think God builds patience in you? He doesn't just snap his finger and make you patient. So how does God place the virtue of patience inside you. The main way he does it is through the suffering that you endure, through the challenges that you go through. Paul writes about this in even more detail than James. Paul writes this. This is in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. Paul says, we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces patience, and that patience produces character, and that character produces hope. Did you catch that? Did you hear what Paul wrote there? Suffering produces patience. So when you say, God, make me more patient, you need to know that one of the ways God is going to accomplish that is through the suffering that you endure. So that's number 2. Suffering builds or teaches patience. Number 3, suffering teaches us wisdom. If you talk to a person who is wise, that person has suffered. You can take that to the bank. It's guaranteed. If you've ever read the book of Psalms, you have probably been impressed by the deep wisdom in the Psalms. Most of those Psalms were written in times of great stress, great difficulty. You've read the book of Proverbs, perhaps, and been impressed by the great wisdom in the book of Proverbs. Many of the Proverbs were written during times of great difficulty and great stress. It's true in the New Testament as well. When you read Paul's profound, deep wisdom written in his epistles, and you realize that many of his epistles were written from prison to experience hardship and to endure it, and to come out of the hardship not a bitter person, but a better person, is one of the blessed outcomes of suffering. It leads to Christian maturity and to wisdom. And so that's number 3. That's the third thing God accomplishes through our suffering. Suffering teaches wisdom. Number 4, suffering makes us lean more on God. Our sufferings draw us to God. Now, you've noticed that in your own life, haven't you? Don't you pray more when you're going through a difficult time than you do when everything's fine? Don't you lean more on God when you're going through hard times? Don't you seek for God more in the great times of stress and difficulty in your life? I was reading something about oak trees and these vines that twirl around oak trees. Do you know that in storms, you know what those vines do? They cling to the oak tree. If the vine is on the side of the tree where the storm is, the vines will press themselves up against the tree. If they're on the opposite side, the tree acts as a buffer, a shelter against the storm. In the storms, the vines cling to the tree. That's what suffering does for us. It's in our sufferings that we learn that we really can depend upon God. That's what he says here about Job in verse 11, the verse we read tonight. He said it was at the end of Job's trials, and you remember all of Job's trials, how he lost his health, he lost his children, he lost his fortune, his friends abandoned him, his wife gave up on him. Job lost almost everything, but it was in his trials that Job learns what? What does he say? He learned that the Lord is full of compassion and is merciful. I looked that word up, full of compassion. I looked it up in the Greek language to see what it says. I was fascinated by what I found. You're not going to believe it. The literal translation is that the Lord is full of intestines. Now you read that and you think, what? What does that mean? But the idea among the Greeks was that it was in there, in the intestines, in your stomach, or we would say in the gut. That's the seat of feeling. You know, you say so, you feel something in your gut, it means, you know, like you have a hunch, an impulse. They had a similar way of thinking about the feelings, that the feelings and the emotion reside there in the stomach area. And so he's saying that that's how God feels about you, that God is full of feeling and emotion and love for you, that he's merciful. The hard times draw us close to God and make us realize as we seek him, that he is full of love for us, full of compassion and mercy. That's what Job found out in his trials. And it was only because of what he had gone through that Job learned that great lesson, that God is compassionate and merciful. So that's number 4. Suffering makes us lean more on God, and that's a good thing. And then the last one, suffering creates opportunities for growth and change. Think about it. We don't grow when we're comfortable. We don't make changes when we are complacent. We grow when we're stressed, when we're challenged. How do you build muscle? You stress your muscles, right? You lift weights, you do push-ups, you do pull-ups. How do you build muscles in your legs? You walk, you run. Stressing your muscle makes stronger muscles. It's the same way spiritually. The challenges of life stress us and serve as the impetus for change and for growth. Life's most difficult moments are the greatest opportunity for growth and change. We don't like them, but they often stir us up out of our complacency and make us change. The English writer Somerset Maugham told a story about a young man who was a janitor at St. Peter's Church in London. Now this was a swanky, uptown, upscale kind of church in an upscale neighborhood. And this janitor was illiterate. He could neither read nor write. And so when the priest, the new priest there in the church, found out that the janitor was illiterate, he felt that that just was not in keeping with the kind of church he wanted to have. And so he fired the janitor on the spot. Now here this janitor was without a job. But he had a little bit of savings. And so he took that little bit of savings that he had and he invested it in a very small, not even a tobacco shop, kind of a kiosk, if you know what those are, a little stand on the street. But he worked hard, he made more money, and he took that money and he invested in a larger shop. And they saved his money from that and then invested it in another shop. And before long, he had tobacco shops all over the city of London. One day he was in the bank and he was talking to his banker, and by this time he was a very wealthy man. And the banker, who knew his story, said to him, you've done pretty well for a man who is illiterate. Just think where you could be if you could read and write. And the man said, if I could read and write, I'd still be the janitor at St. Peter's Church in London. And you see, that man understood that it was this great period of trial in his life, the test that came to him, this period of difficulty that served as the impetus to make him go out and make changes in his life. Again, no one likes to suffer. No one likes the challenges and difficulties when they come to us. But God has a gift for you in every difficulty that you face. And you know what that gift is? It is the opportunity to make changes and to grow. That's the 5th thing that God does with the difficulties of our lives. They create opportunity for growth and change. This was true with Job. It was true with this janitor at St. Peter's Church. You see it throughout history. Florence Nightingale reformed the hospitals of England from her own sickbed. Louis Pasteur was semi-paralyzed when he discovered a cure for polio. John Bunyan started working on the Christian classic Pilgrim's Progress from a prison cell. This is a principle of Christian living, that suffering stirs us out of our complacency. And if you are going through a great challenge right now, a great difficulty, whatever it is, inside of that difficulty, God has a gift for you. And it is the opportunity to make changes and to grow. And so here again are the things God accomplishes in the challenges of our lives, the difficulties, the suffering. Number 1, suffering builds character. Number 2, suffering teaches patience. Number 3, suffering makes us depend more on God. Number 4, Suffering teaches us wisdom. And number 5, suffering creates opportunities for growth and change. Suffering is part of the story. And now you know the rest of the story. I'm glad that you are here with me today. Next week we're going to have one more sermon from the book of James. It's not going to be on suffering. It's a different theme. I hope you'll be here with me for that. Until then, I am praying for you. Stay safe. Stay hopeful. May God bless and keep you until next Sunday.